The sun was setting over the small, quiet town of Silverpine, and a chilly breeze whispered through the dense forest that bordered its edges. Two stray dogs roamed the outskirts, Max and Bolt, both once proud police canines who had served in the force for years before being retired due to age and injuries. Life hadn't been kind to them since then. They wandered aimlessly, surviving on scraps, sleeping under bridges, and sometimes curling up near campfires built by kind travelers. Yet despite their ragged fur and lean bodies, their sharp instincts and training were still intact. That evening, as they walked along a worn trail leading deeper into the woods, Max suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, his ears twitching and nose quivering. Bolt froze too, sensing something unusual. Max tilted his head, listening intently, and then they both heard it, a faint, muffled sound carried by the cold wind. It was soft, but unmistakable, the sound of a child crying. Without hesitation, Max let out a short bark to signal Bolt, and the two dogs began trotting cautiously toward the sound. With each step, the cries grew louder, more desperate, and the smell of fear mixed with damp earth filled their noses. They weaved between trees and climbed over roots until they reached a small clearing hidden deep inside the forest, and that's when they saw her. A little girl, no older than 7, sat on the ground with her back against a thick oak tree. Her tiny wrists were tied tightly with rough rope, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her lips trembled as she whimpered softly, her big brown eyes filled with terror. Max and Bolt exchanged a quick glance, both understanding the gravity of the situation without a sound. Max approached slowly, lowering his head to appear less threatening, while Bolt stayed behind, scanning the shadows for any signs of danger. When Max came close, the girl flinched, expecting harm, but his gentle whine calmed her slightly. She whispered hoarsely, "Please, help me." And that was all the confirmation Max needed. Max sniffed at the ropes, analyzing the knots, while Bolt circled the perimeter, his ears constantly twitching at every rustle of leaves. Suddenly, Bolt froze. The faint crunch of footsteps reached his ears. Someone was nearby. He gave a sharp bark to warn Max, who immediately positioned himself protectively between the girl and the sound. The little girl's breath quickened, and she whispered frantically, "They'll come back! Please, they'll come back!" Max growled low and deep, a sound that carried both authority and warning. Bolt crouched low in the bushes, ready to pounce if needed. The footsteps drew closer, and soon 2 shadowy figures emerged from behind the trees. They were men, dressed in dark hoodies, whispering angrily to each other. One of them pointed toward the girl, his voice filled with frustration. "We shouldn't have left her here alone," he hissed. "If anyone finds her, we're done." The other man grunted. "Relax, no one comes out here, she's not going anywhere." But then his eyes fell on Max and Bolt, and he stopped mid-step. For a moment, there was silence. The men stared at the 2 dogs, expecting them to back away, but Max bared his teeth and let out a fierce bark that echoed through the clearing. Bolt stepped out of the shadows beside him, his hackles raised, teeth glinting in the fading light. These weren't ordinary strays. There was something commanding, almost militaristic in their stance. The men hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. "Stupid mutts," one finally muttered, grabbing a stick from the ground and stepping forward. He swung it down toward Max, but Max dodged with lightning speed and lunged, his jaws clamping onto the man's arm. The man screamed, dropping the stick, and fell to the ground. Before the second man could react, Bolt charged at him like a bullet, tackling him with such force that he crashed into the dirt. The sudden ferocity of the attack left both kidnappers stunned and panicked. They scrambled to their feet and tried to fight back, but years of police training had turned Max and Bolt into a perfect team. Max barked sharply, and Bolt responded instantly, circling behind the men and snapping at their legs, forcing them to back away from the girl. In the chaos, the girl sobbed louder, terrified yet hopeful. Max quickly returned to her, biting and pulling at the ropes with precision until the fibers began to fray. Bolt kept the men at bay, growling and lunging every time they tried to approach. One of the men finally shouted, "Forget it, let's get out of here!" And they bolted into the woods, vanishing into the thick underbrush. Max worked feverishly until the ropes snapped free, and the little girl collapsed into his fur, clutching him tightly as tears streamed down her face. She whispered, "Thank you. Thank you." But there was no time to rest. Max barked softly to Bolt, signaling it was time to move. They needed to get her somewhere safe before the men returned. With reinforcements, Bolt nudged the girl gently, guiding her to climb onto his back. And together, the two dogs led her out of the clearing, away from danger, their senses on high alert as the forest darkened around them. The forest grew darker with every passing second as Max and Bolt guided the frightened little girl away from the clearing where they had found her. The girl clung tightly to Bolt's neck, her tiny fingers buried deep in his fur, trembling so hard that her teeth chattered. Max trotted, slightly ahead, his nose low to the ground, tracking a safe path out of the woods while his ears remained perked for any sound behind them. He could still smell the faint metallic tang of blood from the man he had bitten earlier, and knew the kidnappers wouldn't give up so easily. Bolt glanced at Max occasionally, communicating through subtle signals, a short huff, a flick of the ears, a low growl. Their training as police K9s had forged an unbreakable bond. They didn't need words to understand each other. Right now, Max's focus was on getting the girl somewhere safe, but Bolt kept glancing behind them, alert for danger. Suddenly, the faint crack of a twig snapped the silence. Bolt froze instantly, lowering his body and swiveling his head toward the sound. Max stopped too, ears pricked, his body tense. The girl whimpered softly into Bolt's fur, too scared to speak. A few seconds later, muffled voices drifted through the trees. The kidnappers were following them. Max growled low in his throat, and Bolt responded with a quiet bark, signaling that they needed to move. Fast. They broke into a steady trot, guiding the girl through the thick underbrush and around gnarled roots that clawed at the earth like skeletal hands. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows, every sound amplified by the growing darkness. The girl's small sobs and shaky breaths made Bolt nudge her gently, trying to reassure her. "It's okay," she whispered to herself, as if convincing her own heart. "It's okay. They'll keep me safe." Max's sharp instincts led them along deer trails and narrow gaps between rocks, paths only animals would know. But the voices behind them grew louder, angrier, and the sound of snapping twigs and rustling leaves made it clear the kidnappers were gaining ground. Suddenly, a loud shout echoed through the woods, followed by the beam of a flashlight cutting through the trees. The men were closer than Max had thought. Bolt barked sharply, a warning, and Max immediately changed direction, veering left toward a shallow ravine. The slope was steep, but it would buy them precious seconds. Bolt crouched low, allowing the girl to slide carefully down his back and cling to his fur as they descended. Max reached the bottom first, splashing into a narrow stream, the icy water soaking his paws. He paused just long enough to check the air before urging Bolt and the girl across. Above them, the kidnappers cursed as they realized the dogs had gone downhill. The girl stumbled slightly on the wet rocks, but Bolt steadied her with his body, guiding her step by step. Once they reached the other side, Max led them into a dense thicket, where the branches were so close together it was nearly impossible to see through. It provided cover, but Max knew it wouldn't hold forever. For several tense minutes they crouched in the darkness, silent except for the girl's shaky breathing. Max listened carefully, his ears twitching, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. Then came the sound they were waiting for, heavy footsteps splashing through the stream behind them. The kidnappers were following their trail. Max's heart raced. They couldn't keep running forever, not with the girl slowing them down. He exchanged a glance with Bolt, and in that silent moment, they decided to fight if necessary. Bolt crouched low, ready to strike at the first sign of danger, while Max positioned himself protectively in front of the girl. The kidnappers emerged from the trees, their faces lit faintly by the beam of a flickering flashlight. One of them carried a heavy branch, clearly intending to use it as a weapon, while the other gripped something metallic, a small knife. "There they are!" one of them hissed, pointing the flashlight toward the thicket. "Get the kid! Deal with the dogs if you have to!" They stepped forward cautiously, underestimating the fury of two trained K9s. Max erupted with a deep thunderous bark that seemed to shake the night air, Bolt lunged from the shadows with blinding speed, knocking the man with the knife off his feet and pinning him to the ground. The second man swung his makeshift weapon at Max, but Max ducked and snapped his jaws around the branch, yanking it clean out of his hands. The man staggered backward, tripping over a root, and before he could recover, Max leapt onto his chest, snarling viciously inches from his face. The kidnappers screamed and kicked wildly, but Bolt's teeth grazed the arm of one man, drawing a sharp cry of pain. It didn't take long for the men to realize they were outmatched. "Forget it," one of them yelled, scrambling to his feet. "We'll find her later." They bolted into the woods, crashing noisily through the undergrowth until the sound of their retreat faded into the night. Max stood panting heavily, ears flicking, waiting to be sure they were really gone. Bolt growled low, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, but the forest was silent again, except for the distant hoot of an owl. Finally, Max turned to the girl, who had pressed herself against a tree, her eyes wide with terror and awe. He padded up to her slowly and nudged her hand gently with his nose. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur, whispering a shaky, "Thank you," over and over. But Max knew it wasn't over yet. Those men would come back, and they couldn't risk staying in the woods any longer. He barked softly at Bolt, who understood immediately. Together they nudged and guided the girl back onto Bolt's back and set off again, this time heading toward the edge of the forest where Max remembered a road cutting through the trees. If they could make it there, maybe they could find help. The night air grew colder as they trudged on, but neither dog slowed, their breaths coming in white puffs of determination. The girl, though exhausted, clung tightly to Bolt, trusting him completely now. Somewhere far behind them, the faint sound of shouting echoed once again, but Max didn't look back. He pushed forward, leading them out of the darkness, unaware. That fate was about to bring them face to face with someone from their past, someone who could change everything. The forest slowly began to thin as Max led the way, his keen nose picking up faint scents of asphalt and gasoline, a sign that a road was close. Bolt followed closely, carrying the little girl carefully on his back while constantly glancing behind them, his ears twitching at every distant rustle. The night air was heavy with tension, and the only sounds were the crunch of dried leaves beneath their paws and the faint sniffles of the terrified child. She had stopped crying now, holding on tightly, her trust in the two dogs absolute. But Max could sense it. They weren't safe yet. He could still smell the kidnappers somewhere. Behind them, faint but persistent, like shadows refusing to let go. The deeper instincts from his years as a canine told him they were being hunted. After another 10 minutes of weaving through trees and ducking beneath low-hanging branches, Max finally spotted a faint glow through the darkness ahead. Headlights. A narrow road cut through the forest, like a lifeline. Relief surged through him, but there was no time to slow down. Bolt, sensing Max's urgency, adjusted his pace, and together they emerged from the tree line onto the gravel shoulder of the road. As if fate itself had intervened, a police cruiser came into view, its headlights piercing the dark. Max darted onto the road, barking loudly and running in circles to get the driver's attention. The car screeched to a halt, and the door swung. Open out stepped Officer Daniels, the same officer who had trained Max and Bolt years ago during their police service. He blinked in disbelief, his hand frozen halfway to his holster. "Max? Bolt?" he breathed, as though he couldn't trust his eyes. The little girl slid down from Bolt's back and clung to Daniels's leg, sobbing, "Please, help me." Daniels crouched instantly, wrapping his arms around her protectively, but his gaze remained fixed on the two dogs. His voice trembled as he whispered, "I thought I'd never see you boys again." Max barked urgently, snapping Daniels out of his daze. He quickly ushered the girl into the cruiser and grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, he said, his voice steady but fast. "I've located missing child Emily Turner. Repeat." "Missing child located. She's safe, but we have 2 suspects on foot in Silver Pine Forest. Requesting immediate backup." The radio crackled with static before confirming reinforcements were on their way. Daniels turned back to Max and Bolt, crouching low so they could see his face. "You found her, didn't you?" he murmured, emotion thick in his voice. Max gave a short bark, and Bolt nudged the girl gently before stepping back toward the forest, ears twitching. Daniels frowned, following Bolt's gaze. It was then he heard it too. Faint shouts and the crunch of footsteps somewhere in the distance. The kidnappers weren't done yet. Before Daniels could react, a beam of light cut through the trees as one of the men appeared at the edge of the road, panting and wild-eyed. "Give us the girl," he shouted hoarsely, brandishing a knife in one hand. Daniels immediately drew his weapon, holding it steady. "Drop it, police!" he barked, but the man ignored him, charging forward. In an instant, Max and Bolt exploded into action. Max darted low and fast, clamping his jaws around the man's wrist before he could swing the blade. The man screamed, dropping the knife, just as Bolt lunged and tackled him to the ground with a force that knocked the wind out of him. But the second kidnapper wasn't far behind. He came crashing through the trees from the other side, holding a crowbar, and Daniels barely had time to aim before the man swung wildly. The blow glanced off the cruiser's hood, leaving a deep dent. Daniels moved to intercept, but Bolt was faster. He darted from the first man and lunged at the second, biting down hard on his ankle. The man roared in pain, stumbling backward, and Max seized the opportunity, leaping high and knocking the crowbar out of his hands. The fight was brutal, fast and chaotic, but the two dogs worked seamlessly, their years of training surfacing instinctively. Within minutes, both men were on the ground, writhing and groaning, restrained by Daniels, who secured them with handcuffs, as sirens wailed in the distance. Backup had arrived. 2 more cruisers pulled up, their flashing lights bathing the scene in red and blue. Officers poured out, some rushing to secure the kidnappers, others checking on the girl, who sat safely. Inside Daniel's car, her small face pressed against the window, tears streaking down her cheeks, but now they were tears of relief. Daniels crouched beside Max and Bolt, rubbing their ears as he whispered, "I don't know how you two ended up here, but you just saved this little girl's life." Max licked his hand softly, and Bolt rested his head against Daniel's knee, their tails wagging slowly, almost shyly. The other officers stood nearby, murmuring in awe as they learned the truth. 2 retired canines, abandoned and living as strays, had single-handedly rescued a kidnapped child and taken down 2 dangerous criminals. Once the kidnappers were secured, in the back of the police cruisers, Daniels approached Emily, who clung to his arm as he carried her to safety. "We're taking you home now," he reassured her softly. "You're safe." The girl turned to glance at Max and Bolt, whispering, "They saved me. Please don't leave them behind." Daniels smiled faintly, his chest tightening. "Don't worry," he promised. "They're coming with us." As the convoy of police cars pulled away from the forest, Max and Bolt sat side by side in the back seat of Daniel's cruiser, their heads resting against each other. Outside, the road stretched, ahead beneath a canopy of stars, but for the first time in years, they didn't feel lost. The girl sat beside them, curled up and fast asleep, her small hand resting on Bolt's paw. Daniels glanced in the rearview mirror, his throat tight with unspoken gratitude. He didn't know what destiny had brought them together again, but deep down he knew this wasn't just a reunion. It was the beginning of something far bigger. The following morning, the sleepy town of Silverpine awoke to news that spread faster than wildfire. A missing child had been found alive. 2 dangerous kidnappers were in custody. But the detail that made the story extraordinary, almost unbelievable, was that the rescuers weren't police officers or trained professionals. They were 2 stray dogs, Max and Bolt. Inside the Silverpine Police Department, the atmosphere was buzzing. Officers, detectives, and even townsfolk who had heard the news gathered to catch a glimpse of the heroic canines. Officer Daniels sat at his desk, watching Max and Bolt resting comfortably on a soft blanket near his feet. It had been years since he had last seen them. Memories flooded his mind. The training days, the endless drills, the missions where they'd saved lives. Together. Back then, Max was the disciplined leader, sharp and steady, while Bolt was the lightning-fast sprinter, fearless and impulsive. They had been his partners, his teammates, his family. Losing them when they were retired had left an emptiness he had buried deep. But seeing them now, alive, strong, and still saving lives, made his chest swell with pride. Just outside Daniel's office, 7-year-old Emily Turner sat huddled between her mother and father, who hadn't stopped hugging her since the moment she had been returned to them. Her mother's eyes were red from hours of crying, while her father's hands trembled as he stroked her hair. Emily, exhausted but safe, clutched a small paper cup of hot chocolate and glanced over at Max and Bolt. The moment her gaze met theirs, she smiled softly and whispered something to her mother, who nodded with tearful eyes. A few moments later, Emily walked up to Daniels, tugging gently at his sleeve. "Officer, can I say thank you to them?" she asked shyly, pointing at the 2 dogs. Daniels smiled and nodded, guiding her forward. Max lifted his head as Emily approached, and Bolt's tail thumped against the blanket. Without hesitation, Emily knelt down and wrapped her small arms around Max's neck, burying her face in his fur. Then she leaned over and kissed Bolt's head. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'll never forget you." Max nudged her cheek with his nose, and Bolt gave her hand a soft lick. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, and when Emily's father cleared his throat, his voice wavered as he said, "We'd like to adopt them, Officer Daniels, if that's possible." Daniels glanced at Max and Bolt, who now sat alert, as if they understood every word. He hesitated for a moment, his heart torn between his own longing to keep them close and the undeniable bond they had formed with Emily. But before he could answer, the police chief entered the room, holding a folder in one hand. "Before we discuss adoptions, there's something you should all know," the chief said gravely. "These kidnappers, they weren't working alone." The room fell silent. Daniels frowned. "What do you mean?" The chief opened the folder and pulled out several photographs. "The 2 men we arrested last night are part of a larger human trafficking ring. We've been tracking this network for months, and Emily's abduction wasn't random. They've taken other children before. We suspect there may still be victims out there." Emily's mother gasped, clutching her daughter tightly. Daniels's jaw clenched as his gaze dropped to Max and Bolt. Even in retirement, these 2 had stumbled into something far bigger than anyone realized. "Do we know how many suspects are still at large?" Daniels asked. "Not yet," the chief replied grimly. "But our intel suggests at least 4 more operatives in the area. They'll know by now that their men were arrested, and they'll be desperate. We need every officer on high alert." Daniels glanced at Emily, whose tired eyes were now wide with fear. He crouched beside her, speaking softly. "Don't worry, you're safe now. We won't let anyone hurt you." Again. But deep down, he knew the danger wasn't over. If the remaining traffickers thought Emily could identify them, they might try again, and soon. Later that day, Daniels took Max and Bolt outside for some fresh air. The 2 dogs lay in the grass near the station's parking lot, soaking up the morning sun. Daniels sat beside them, absent-mindedly scratching behind Max's ears. "I thought yesterday was the end of it," he murmured quietly, more to himself than to them. "But I think we've just opened the door to something much bigger." Bolt lifted his head suddenly, ears twitching, and let out a low growl. Max sat up instantly, nose to the wind. Daniels followed their gaze toward the street. A black SUV had parked across the road, engine still running. Its windows were tinted, and though no one stepped out, the presence was unsettling. Daniel's instincts screamed that something wasn't right. He stood slowly, resting his hand on his holster. Before he could approach, the SUV roared to life and sped away, tires screeching as it disappeared around the corner. Daniels stared after it, his heart pounding. He knew that wasn't a coincidence. Someone was watching them. Someone was planning something. That night, Daniels couldn't sleep. He sat in his small office, reviewing case files and maps while Max and Bolt dozed nearby. Every creak of the building made them stir, ears perking, muscles tense. Finally, Daniels leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. "We've got a storm coming," he whispered under his breath. Max opened one eye, his gaze steady and unblinking, as if he understood. Meanwhile, across town, The black SUV pulled into an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Silver Pine. Inside, 4 men gathered around a battered wooden table. One slammed his fist against the surface, sending papers flying. "Those dogs ruined everything," he snarled. "We had the girl. We were supposed to be gone by now." Another man, older and calmer, leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "The police have her now, which means it's only a matter of time before she talks. She's just a kid," one of the younger men said nervously. "She doesn't know our faces." "Doesn't matter," the leader snapped. "We can't take chances. The boss wants her silenced, and those dogs too." The room went quiet, the weight of his words sinking in. Outside, the wind howled through broken windows, rattling loose metal sheets. The hunt wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. Back at the Turner household, Emily slept peacefully between her parents, unaware of the danger that still loomed. Max and Bolt, however, were restless. They lay at the foot of her bed, eyes half closed, but ears constantly twitching, as though they could sense the storm gathering in the shadows. Their days as retired strays were over. The battle wasn't behind them. It was ahead. 2 nights after Emily's rescue, Silver Pine seemed calm on the surface, but beneath the quiet streets and glowing porch lights, the town was on edge. Every officer at the station had been briefed about the trafficking ring, and Daniels barely left Emily's side. Her parents had upgraded security around their home, but he knew deep down that locks and cameras wouldn't stop desperate men. Max and Bolt stayed with the family, refusing to leave Emily's room. They had become her silent guardians, taking turns resting by her bed while the other patrolled the hallway. Whenever a branch scraped against the window or a car passed too slowly on the street outside, they'd perk up instantly, muscles tense, ready to defend her at any cost. Their instincts told them something was coming, something dangerous. And they were right. It was just after midnight when Bolt's ears twitched at a faint sound outside, footsteps on gravel, soft but deliberate. He nudged Max awake, and both dogs silently crept to the window. Through the thin curtains, they spotted shadows moving across the lawn. 4 figures dressed in black, faces covered, approached the Turner house with precision and silence. One of them raised a hand, giving signals, while another crouched near the side door, pulling tools from his pocket. They were professionals, moving like predators closing in on prey. Max growled low in his throat, and Bolt's lips curled back, baring his teeth. Without making a sound, Max nudged Emily gently, waking her up. She sat up groggily, rubbing her eyes, but Max licked her hand urgently, making her understand that something was wrong. Emily whispered softly for her parents, and within seconds, her father burst into the room, just as Bolt gave a sharp, deep bark, a signal they didn't give lightly. Daniels had warned the Turners that if the dogs ever barked like that, it meant immediate danger. Emily's father grabbed his phone and called Daniels directly, while Emily's mother ushered her into the corner of the room, holding her tightly. Outside, the intruders froze when they heard Bolt's bark, their plan instantly compromised. "Move fast," one hissed. "They know we're here." Within seconds, one of them smashed a side window and climbed inside. Max and Bolt exploded into action. Max lunged first, slamming into the intruder with the force of a battering ram. The man crashed against the wall with a grunt, dropping the crowbar in his hand. Bolt followed instantly, clamping his teeth around the man's arm before he could recover. The intruder screamed, but his muffled cries were drowned out by the chaos erupting outside as the other men kicked open the back door. Emily's father shouted, "Upstairs now," as he grabbed a baseball bat and positioned himself between the stairs and the hallway. Emily clung to her mother, tears streaming down her face, but Max nudged her gently, almost as if to say, "Stay calm, we're here." Downstairs, Bolt was locked in a brutal struggle with the second intruder, dodging swings and snapping at his legs, while Max darted between them, barking furiously, forcing the men to back into a corner. Suddenly, a loud crash shook the entire house. The third man had kicked open the front door, shotgun in hand. Before he could aim, Max sprinted at him, leaping high and sinking his teeth into the man's shoulder, forcing him to drop the weapon. The shotgun clattered across the hardwood floor, skidding beneath the coffee table. Bolt quickly darted forward and pushed it out of reach with his nose, barking sharply as if signaling Emily's father to grab it. Upstairs, Emily's parents barricaded themselves in the bedroom with her, but panic was rising fast. Her mother whispered, "We need the police now." Daniels had already been alerted, and his cruiser roared through the quiet streets, sirens blaring, but every second felt like an eternity. Meanwhile, the fourth intruder climbed through an upstairs window, creeping silently toward Emily's room. Max, still downstairs, sensed it. He stopped mid-fight, ears twitching, and bolted up the stairs, his claws scraping against the wooden steps. The man opened the bedroom door slowly, knife in hand, but before he could take a step, Max launched himself at him like a cannonball. They both tumbled into the hallway, crashing into a dresser. The knife clattered away as Max pinned the man down, snarling with such intensity that the intruder froze, wide-eyed with terror. Downstairs, Bolt continued fighting the other two men when headlights suddenly lit up the driveway. Officer Daniels burst through the front door, weapon drawn, shouting, "Police! Drop your weapons!" The two men hesitated, but Bolt lunged one last time, knocking one of them to the floor. Daniels fired a warning shot into the ceiling, and finally, the chaos stilled. Within seconds, backup units arrived, surrounding the house. One by one, the intruders were dragged outside in handcuffs. The man Max had pinned upstairs whimpered as officers pulled him away, avoiding the dog's fiery gaze. Emily sat in her mother's lap, trembling but unharmed, as Daniels knelt down to her level. "It's over," he said softly, his voice steady and reassuring. "You're safe now. I promise." Max padded over to her and rested his head on her lap, his warm fur comforting her shaking hands. Bolt lay nearby, panting heavily but alert, his golden eyes fixed on the flashing red and blue lights outside. Daniels turned to one of the detectives and muttered, "They weren't trying to kidnap her again. They were trying to silence her." The detective nodded grimly. "We've got confirmation from one of the suspects. This isn't just a small operation. There's a bigger network pulling the strings, and they won't stop." Daniels looked down at Max and Bolt, who were lying side by side, chests rising and falling heavily after the fight. Despite everything, they had saved Emily again. Heroes didn't always wear badges or uniforms. Sometimes they walked on four legs. That night, the Turner house was swarming with officers, detectives, and crime scene techs. Neighbors stood outside, whispering in shock as news spread of the attempted attack. Inside, Emily sat curled up with Max and Bolt, finally drifting into an exhausted sleep. Daniels watched her from the doorway, his hand resting on the frame, his jaw tight. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. If anything, tonight proved that Emily and her family were still in danger. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, Daniels glanced at the darkened horizon. Somewhere out there, someone higher up in the trafficking ring was furious, and they would strike again. But this time, Daniels wouldn't let them get close. Not while Max and Bolt were by his side. The battle was won, but the war had just begun. The following morning, sunlight poured through the Turner family's kitchen windows, but the house still felt cold, as though the shadows of last night's attack clung stubbornly to the walls. Emily sat at the table clutching a steaming mug of cocoa, her small hands trembling slightly despite her brave face. Max lay at her feet, his big head resting protectively on her lap, while Bolt paced near the door, ears twitching at every sound. Outside, Officer Daniels sat across from Emily's parents, a grim expression on his face as he laid out photos of the four captured intruders. "They're just soldiers," he said, tapping the images with his finger. "Someone else is pulling the strings. Until we take down whoever's in charge, Emily isn't safe." The words hung heavily in the air, pulling everyone into silence. But Max and Bolt seemed to sense the weight of the moment. Bolt stopped pacing, sitting tall and alert, his golden eyes locked on Daniels as if he understood everything being said. 2 days later, the investigation led Daniels and his team to a remote warehouse on the outskirts of Silver Pine, an abandoned freight depot surrounded by thick woods and hidden from view. Drones confirmed movement inside, and heat signatures suggested more than a dozen people were operating there. This was no ordinary hideout. It was the nerve center of the trafficking ring. Daniels was put in charge of leading the raid, but he refused to go without Max and Bolt. "They've saved Emily twice," he told his captain. "If anyone deserves to finish this, it's them." The captain hesitated, but agreed. Night fell quickly over the forest as the SWAT vans rolled silently. Along the dirt road, headlights dimmed to avoid detection. Inside one of the vans, Max sat calmly beside Daniels, his tail curled around his body, while Bolt shifted restlessly, low growls rumbling in his throat. The moment the vehicle stopped, the dogs tensed like coiled springs, sensing danger ahead. Daniels checked his rifle, gave the hand signal, and the team moved out. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its metal walls rusted and cracked, light leaking faintly from grimy windows. A guard stood outside smoking a cigarette, oblivious to the danger creeping through the trees. Daniels whispered a command and Bolt slunk forward like a shadow. Without making a sound, he pounced, tackling the guard to the ground and pinning him before he could even shout. Max joined seconds later, dragging the man's weapon out of reach. With the guard secured, the team closed in. The first breach was explosive, literally. The SWAT team blew the side door, storming in with flashbangs and shouts, and chaos erupted inside. Men scrambled for weapons, papers flew, and crates toppled as Max and Bolt surged into the fight alongside the officers. Bolt darted left, cutting off an escape route, while Max charged straight ahead, bowling over two men who had grabbed rifles. Daniels followed close behind, barking orders, his heart pounding in sync with the thunder of boots and gunfire. But the traffickers were prepared. From a second-floor balcony, one of the ringleaders pulled out a pistol and fired wildly, forcing the officers to dive for cover. Daniels ducked behind a stack of crates, returning fire, but the man had the high ground. Suddenly, Max tore up, the metal stairs two at a time, his claws clanging against the steps, and launched himself at the gunman. The man barely had time to react before Max clamped his jaws around his arm, sending the weapon clattering across the floor. Bolt bounded, up behind them, knocking another armed thug backward over the railing. Within minutes, the warehouse was under control. Officers cuffed suspects one by one, herding them into a line against the wall. Dozens of terrified children were discovered locked in the back rooms, malnourished and scared but alive. One by one, they were carried out, wrapped in blankets and handed to medics waiting outside. Among the rescued was a girl barely older than Emily, who clung to Bolt's neck like a lifeline, whispering over and over, "Thank you, doggy." Daniel's throat tightened as he watched Max sniff gently at the rescued children, his tail wagging softly as though reassuring them it was finally over. Back at the station, the media swarmed, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions. For the first time, the nation knew about the trafficking network and the two stray dogs who had helped dismantle it. "Heroes," one headline read, "the canines who saved Silver Pine." Daniels crouched beside Max and Bolt during the press conference, one hand resting on each of their shoulders. "These two aren't just dogs," he said into the microphone. "They're officers, they're family. Without them, Emily wouldn't be alive today, and neither would dozens of other children. The world owes them more than we can ever repay." Weeks passed, and the town slowly returned to normal. Emily laughed again, playing in the yard while Max and Bolt chased each other through the grass, tongues lolling happily. Her nightmares grew less frequent, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she slept soundly at night. Daniels filed adoption papers for both dogs, officially making them part of the Silver Pine Police K-9 unit. They were no longer strays. They had a purpose, a home, and a family who loved them. On the day of their official induction ceremony, hundreds gathered at the town square. Children waved handmade signs with paw prints and hearts, while parents clapped and cheered. Daniels knelt between Max and Bolt, medals glinting on their collars as the mayor announced, "For extraordinary bravery and unwavering loyalty, we honor officers Max and Bolt." The crowd erupted in applause, but the dogs just wagged their tails, blissfully unaware of the fame they'd earned.